Good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to open our first panel titled Ensuring Safety and Integrity in Virtual Worlds, and to introduce our three excellent speakers that we have here with us. Professor Simon van der Hof, Professor of Law and Digital Technologies from Leiden University. Next to me, Professor Verity McIntosh, Professor of Immersive Arts and Culture from University of West England in Bristol. And last but not least, Marco Correa from Legal and Technology Counsel from Leiden University. This is a very timely, relevant panel, I would say, given our discussion of how virtual worlds are challenging existing legal frameworks, especially when it comes to the protection of children and employees' rights and safety. And now it's my great pleasure to pass the microphone to our speakers who will shed lights on these complex issues. After the presentation, we have a Q&A session. I think it's a better idea to organize like that. Now, let's now hear from Professor Verity McIntosh with the presentation. And I try to give the presentation.
Thank you.
Yes.
Great. Hi. It's going to be a lot of talking today, and I'm really fascinated. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to our conversation already. So my name is Verity McIntosh. I'm a professor of Immersive Arts and Culture at the University of West of England in Bristol. I've been working in XR since 2013, and in kind of policy-facing research for the most of this decade. And I'm looking forward to sharing some thoughts and then hearing some thoughts about how we're currently thinking about employee rights and employer responsibilities in the virtual workplace. It's quite an under-represented field in research, and I think there's a lot that we need to do. There's quite some weird stuff happening with my font, so apologies, I did not send the presentation to you with fonts embedded, so it's going to be a wild ride to see what turns up on the screen. But to give you a little bit of context for me and my research, myself and an incredible colleague, Catherine Allen, have been working in policy-facing research in this space for 5 or 6 years now, including a number of different pieces. So Safeguarding the Metaverse is a report that we wrote in 2022, which set some of the challenges that Simone was elegantly describing there around people's experience of metaverse spaces and the rights that they may have and the rights that might be protected in existing law. I did some work with the Council of Europe, and we'll be returning to that this year, looking at risks and opportunities of the metaverse. We did a couple of reports with a children's charity in the UK called the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, NSPCC, looking at some of those questions about what safeguards children might require to be able to be empowered citizens in digital spaces, particularly in virtual reality. And I've been writing a little bit more recently around what policymakers need to know about instances of peer-to-peer harassment and abuse in metaverse spaces. So there's lots of things we could talk about there, but I'm not going to talk about that because my colleagues have that one down beautifully. What I'm going to talk to you about today is a sort of a gap that I think we're starting to see in these spaces. A lot of this research has really helped policymakers to think about young people's experience, to think about social media as it's experienced in 3 dimensions in these kind of entertainment and social spaces. What we're still not really seeing is much sort of policy level engagement, as we've had through various different laws being passed recently, in this question of adults in a working environment and what rights and protections they might need to be able to advocate for their rights as employees and for employers to be responsible and diligent employers. We are seeing a little bit of a pivot in the way that technology companies are starting to speak about their XR technologies. Apple, for example, when they launched the Apple Vision Pro, were quite clear that it's a professional tool, that's the Pro in the AVP, and that it's a productivity tool, and they pitch it very directly to enterprise markets. And this idea of having kind of 3D assets in your visual field, to be able to have multiple screens, to be able to collaborate with adult colleagues in other working environments is part of the sort of the sell for these products. Microsoft have almost entirely pivoted their HoloLens offer to enterprise markets, particularly the US military, where they have an ongoing sort of multi-million-pound contract to bring augmented reality onto the battlefield. And there are various sort of trends, particularly within Meta, who have been a big sort of push within the consumer market to now pivot into the enterprise market, certainly as much as VR is concerned, and to switch to kind of AI smart glasses for consumer markets. So the enterprise market is really big business for these companies, and yet it's a kind of a quietly had conversation about how the democracies, the human rights that we've been talking about in these more kind of entertainment and social contexts might translate into the workplace. One of the ways that it's showing up in kind of workplace environments at the moment is this idea that XR immersive technology tools offer employers a safe way to simulate what might otherwise be considered unsafe things. So using, for example, virtual reality to give you a first-person experience of a drone as you send a drone into a combat environment, using VR as a sort of training tool to simulate high-stress, high-danger environments to kind of prepare people for going into those spaces in real life, or to use kind of an overlay of augmented information to kind of bring additional data layers into kind of high jeopardy working environments. So these things are starting to embed in all kinds of industries. We're seeing quite sort of strong embedded behaviours already in architecture, in manufacturing, in engineering, in defence military, and in disaster relief. So there are lots of different industrial contexts where, despite the media's enthusiasm for how dead these technologies are, they are actually finding quite sort of resilient sectors within the workplace where they're not going away anytime soon. So what does this mean for employees who are using these tools? We seem to have a real kind of disconnect in the different dialogues that emerge around this. On the one hand, on the left here, we have some of the ideas that VR gives us the best of all worlds, the ability to create a believable, engaging, repeatable emergency, but without the associated danger of the real thing. The idea being your body is not physically implicated, so it's fine. A report commissioned by Meta for Business recently suggested this is the use case, this is the sales idea, because by moving would-be real-life training environments into potentially hazardous or consequential situations to virtual environments on the MetaQuest, learners at the composite can practice and train more frequently in safe VR environments that might not be safe or feasible in person. So really recognising that these simulative technologies are offering the ability to simulate something that you would not place a physical body in. So that's on the one hand, the sort of commercial opportunity, but then on the other hand, we have sort of now decades of neuroscience and psychological insights into what people experience when they go into these simulative environments, these virtual worlds. It's often used as a selling point for sort of story worlds, this idea that you're present, you feel like you're there, you have a first-person experience. You talk about it as I did, I went, I saw, not I watched, I scrolled, I touched. And so this sort of idea that the whole point of virtual worlds is that they are convincing, psychologically convincing, compelling, and experience not as real, but more close to real than screen-based experiences, is now quite well understood in terms of its risks. So Kamal Sinclair talks about virtual reality pieces that hack the user's brain into feeling present in a virtual space and embodied in a virtual body. And those should require a higher level of ethical interrogation than our flat-screen web-based experiences. Neuroscientists and psychologists and ethicists, Madhuri and Metzinger, talk about it in more strong terms. They suggest that torture or high-stress, high-danger environments in a virtual environment is still torture, and the fact that one's suffering occurs whilst one is immersed in a virtual environment does not mitigate the suffering itself. So quite different ways of thinking about the same thing that struggle to reconcile. We we're fortunate enough to sort of encounter this challenge in some recent research that I did with colleagues in robotics and engineering. We were working with Sellafield, which is a nuclear facility in the UK, which is now being decommissioned. It's Europe's most contaminated site. It's a very dangerous environment, lots of sort of decades worth of slightly sketchy industrial practices mean it's heavily contaminated and nobody knows how dangerous it is. And so they're sending teams of robots onto the site to preserve the safety of human bodies. And those robots are being teleoperated by human operators. What we were testing with them is, can we use tools like virtual reality to give those remote operators a more kind of first-person experience, to preserve their sense of being there, to be able to look around, to have spatial reasoning, to be able to kind of incorporate information from data sensing in the space, like how high is the radiation, how hot is it here, what is that pool of weird green slime, and to see if we could give them that information in a way that made them feel like they were there so that they could interpret the environment. I'm not going to get into the weeds of what we did because it was fiddly and boring and complicated, but we did a couple of studies basically testing out different ways that operators, human operators who are not on site, could feel like they were on site and to do these tasks of understanding a contaminated space and starting to kind of clean it up. So we did a couple of different studies where the user was either embodied as a robot or commanding a team of robots. And the thing to notice, I guess, about this is that rather than a training simulation where it's effectively one person in VR and that's what happens, it's one person in VR and that controls the robots on site. So there's sort of three levels of engagement. There's where the operator is, there's the simulation that they're experiencing, and there's the actual kind of nuclear contaminated sites where robots are doing what the person in VR is suggesting, or in fact controlling. Again, let's not get too bogged down in the details, but what we did find, particularly with some of the different ways that we were sonifying data and giving people experience and information, sort of designed experiences, is that the condition that was most effective, most accurate, most swift, really strong performance indicators, the tasks were being done correctly, accurately, swiftly, were experienced as like annoying, distracting, discombobulating, troubling, sometimes quite stressful for operators. Whereas the systems that we designed to be more intuitive were less effective, less accurate, and more distracting, although reported by the operators as more comfortable, made sense, fine, still not great. And that generally, the operators that we work with almost universally reported they would not like to do this as part of their everyday job. Yeah, the technology is cool, but it was horrible. We published all of those things, and what's being cited and used is the fact that this technology is effective and accurate and fast, and so we should all do it. And I have a moral injury here because I feel like we underplayed the user's experience there. And it's feeding into, I think, a greater kind of tendency in our culture of kind of computational thinking. If the tool that we can build increases efficiency, effectiveness, speed, task efficiency, then it's good, and we should mold our vulnerable, squishy flesh bodies into that and our vulnerable, squishy brains into that, because we need to be able to use those tools. And we have come to the point in some of these contexts where we disregard our own personal human experiences because they're inconsistent with the machine's capabilities. And there's a general kind of tendency, I think, to regard any resistance to adopt technologies which are seen as effective and efficient as Ludditism or being kind of illiterate in new computational priorities. We are seeing increasingly these sorts of tools being rolled out, and I think we are due a reckoning, and I have hope that I know where we can find it. It's not new that like commercial imperative can sometimes trump user comfort and employee rights and freedoms. And the piece of work that we as a society have done to mitigate between those things is health and safety legislation, to my mind. I think we know that almost every kind of international nation will have some form of health and safety legislation that is designed to prioritise the rights and protections of employees in the face of commercial imperative. What I think we're struggling with simulative technologies and things like the metaverse is that our existing legislation was generally written a long time before the current technology stacks came in. They didn't really envisage this highly psychologically realistic simulation environment, this sense of being there, this sense of genuinely kind of implication of yourself in a simulation space. They certainly didn't anticipate the fact that that action taken in a simulation might also have a consequence in a different physical space, that you're effectively kind of projecting your mind into a robot's body, for example, and taking consequential action. So we don't really have, for the most part, health and safety language that can describe this industrial use case that's becoming more and more common. So for a worker who is asked or expected to work in these spaces, it's really unclear what they can do. Can I ask, with everyone here, has anyone been invited or expected to work in a simulation or to experience VR as part of their job?
Not as part of the job.
Not as part of the job? Is that not the job? I definitely have. So it is becoming more common. I think there is still generally a sense, certainly within the kind of the research context, that it's at your own discretion and that you are supported. I think in some of the more kind of mechanistic environments, it's not. I think certainly in a lot of engineering and military contexts, it's now just becoming part of the expected job. And so the UK Health and Safety Executive, for example, the only comparable piece of legislation that we have is around screen-based media, and those are recommendations around eye strain and around taking breaks because you might get eye strain. And yes, that applies, but it's a very minimal approach. I'm going to check notes rather than try and remember legislation because I am not a lawyer, and that's why I love being here with you, because you can help me. I've been trying to sort of understand and working with different professionals what contingencies there are in different jurisdictions, and I'm sure there'll be more that you can talk to me about. But the European Agency for Safety and Health at Work does have specific provisions now in place for what's it called? So within the DSC we have. There we go. Yeah, so smart digital systems, which sounds right and useful, but again, the guidance basically targets sensor-driven environments. It's good for data and privacy, not so great for psychological safety, and XR is not specifically provisioned, so it has nothing to offer us about teleoperation, for example. It does have a good provision in EU OSA around recommending that users are involved in the design of technology solutions. Brilliant. Very difficult to see how that's being enacted, as you were saying before. It's not that the laws sometimes aren't there, it's that their operationalisation is far from with us currently. In the US, there is a relatively more specific approach. Virtual, augmented and mixed reality headsets got added to their list of nationally recognised testing laboratory equipment in 2024, so it comes under their health and safety jurisdiction. But again, any recommendations are around clearing the area before someone goes into a headset and making sure that the batteries don't explode. So there is a lot of quite kind of naive or perhaps sort of early stage thinking about what the risks might be. So for today, for the conversation, I'm going to suggest something, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that, and I think it might help us to just start thinking about what do we need that we don't have. So I'm suggesting a place-based framework, suggesting that those operators who are in these high-risk, high-stress, psychologically convincing simulations, particularly those who are enacting activity in real life, there are three planes of reality at work here. There's the corporeal reality, where your body is, where you're physically standing in your living room in a headset and your cat's brushing around your feet. And those are the places where you need to clear some space, you need to make sure your battery is charged, you need to make sure you're not going to be kind of interrupted by someone running into you, and that you might want to watch for things like eye strain and nausea. Absolutely, these are all real things. But there are other planes of reality at play as well. And perhaps the most sort of under-considered space is the simulated reality. Where are you actually going in this virtual reality headset or this mixed reality space? Where are you attending to with all of your kind of cognitive abilities to do this work? Are you in a battle zone? Are you in a protest? Are you in a kind of high-risk disaster scenario? Are you sitting on a beach being super relaxed? it's a different emotional state depending on what that simulation is giving to you. And we know enough about people's experience of simulation to know that we do take those simulations very seriously. We incorporate them in our threat response. I saw an amazing study recently that said if somebody sneezes, if an avatar sneezes in VR, we start producing antibodies. We don't do that when we watch the TV. In VR, we understand that there is a sort of a physically consequential nature of being in proximity in 3D space. It's very relational, it's very emotional, it's very like physically inculcated. So the business of what that simulation is has to matter, and there have to be controls around what people can reasonably be expected to simulate as part of their work. And thinking about things like mental health first aid and trauma-informed care has to be part of that employment contract. There's lots of different ways that we could do that, and there's a paper coming out soon where I make some recommendations, but I'm not going to spend too much time here. But just to nod to that third reality as well, in instances like in Sellafield, if the person in the simulation is also having an effect on another physical space, like in Sellafield, what are their responsibilities? Are they responsible if it goes wrong and they create an industrial accident? Is that the fault of the technology, the person, the employer? Liability is massively under-resolved in this space. Equally, the kind of the professional and emotional consequences for someone who might feel like they weren't sort of trained to be able to do that or weren't given the proper support and protections. What rights do they have to say, that wasn't my fault, or I didn't know that was going to happen, or that has affected me in some way? We do not have the language for the consequences of someone who is maybe in their living room creating a high-level nuclear accident somewhere else. The other thing just to nod to is that those three planes of reality imagine three quite separate things, and I think it's really important that we remember that they're happening all together at the same time. There's a little bit of research now into how that kind of spread of cognitive load across those different realities can really affect your ability to kind of hold attention and hold concentration. We are not unaware that we're in our living room with our cat. We are also not unaware that we're in the simulation. We're not unaware that we're in this third space. And to be able to hold three spaces, three realities in tandem is not a very natural condition for humans. We're not used to it, and we struggle. And there's a challenge to doing it in the moment. There's also a challenge to having done it afterwards. And that ability to kind of decompress, to reground, to understand where you are when you come out is really important for psychological safety. Whereas often these sorts of industrial cases, imagine that you can go in, come out, next thing. There's a lot of going in and coming out that needs to be done in a way that grounds us in terms of what is real, who am I, what is this, for this to in any way be a reasonable industrial use case. So it's not just the three planes, it's the three simultaneous planes. And there's loads more that needs to be done. So we're just starting to look at how this might apply to health and safety legislation, but we're specifically, for kind of simplicity, looking at the idea of one person in a simulation and their actuations. We know, and the term metaverse suggests, that actually most industrial use cases provision for multiple people being in virtual spaces. They may be having a common experience, they may be having uncommon experiences. That social dynamic that kicks in when people are in physical and in virtual space is really complex. We know that AI-driven decision-making is really present in a lot of these industrial use cases, and we've not started to kind of look at the impact of sort of human HCI AI dynamics, especially when it comes to robotics. So there's lots more to do. I think we can kind of start doing it now, and and I think we can build on all of the incredible work that has been done around social and entertainment contexts, but understand that our rights don't stop when we go to work.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Verity. And now, finally, I'd like to turn to Marco Correa, who will share insights on regulatory frameworks for safe immersive environments based on outcomes from the XR for Human project. The floor is yours. I will open your presentation.
Thank you. I think for the sake of time, I will just introduce myself. Marco Correa, as I was presented, but it's interesting for me to be here because I'm part of a university, Leiden University, but actually our department is not a research department. It's a unit support, and all the things we do is basically support faculties in order to implement digital technologies in education. And one of them was actually VR and XR. So that's how we arrived to this project. And yeah, to give you a little bit of context, this was a project made well, for a grant of the Horizon Europe, and it involved, as you can see, a lot of institutions from all across Europe, but not just universities, but also some organizations from civil society that work in this field. So this project aimed to create standards or guidelines in order to have a use and development of XR technologies in Europe in an ethical and safe way. And so it was also very interdisciplinary. We got different professionals and backgrounds, and we kind of target this goal from different perspectives. For example, the ethical perspective, the technical perspective. There was a lot of work in interoperability, and also the more policy regulatory side, which is the one I will address here. Regarding that approach, we did have a kind of layered review of policy. We started, this was already 4 years ago, so of course has changed a little bit, not so much as I would like to, but there was a kind of uneven play field regarding policy discussions in Europe about XR. Of course, there was a lot of talking in certain industries that were more connected and more on board with these technologies, and I'm talking specifically about entertainment and gaming, and most of these discussions, and this connects nicely with Simon's presentation, was about children's rights, but in other industries this was very much into kind of a piloting stage, so the policy was not very discussed already, but also employment was also another one of the kind of areas that was very much in discussion. And we kind of identified the kind of discussions, the challenges that were posed by the industry regarding the use of XR in a safe way. And then the second step was to review how the regulation, and I'm talking just about EU law, we didn't get to national law, but we identify kind of a set of legislations, directives and regulations, I think around 24, that at some point regulated different perspectives of immersive technologies. And we kind of grouped it in three main areas. The first one was mostly safety regulation. So it was more kind of directed to manufacturers of devices and headsets. Also not just general regulation, but specifically to certain kind of areas, for example, healthcare. The medical device regulation also has an impact on XR. Then on the other side, we identified a lot of regulations that were linked to, of course, online platforms, so DSA, DMA, etc. So there was more oriented towards the service providers in the metaverse. And then the general applicable regulation, which, for example, GDPR applies to almost everyone in the kind of XR environment. And one of the kind of, I think, learnings is precisely what Verity was saying, is that a lot of this regulation is actually not suited to XR technologies. It's very outdated, even if it's digital oriented, but yeah, the kind of difference between virtual and physical world and the kind of impact that you can have, that was also not very addressed in these kind of regulations in general. So then with these two things, kind of saying which were the challenges from the policy perspective and also the regulation, how the regulation actually addressed these challenges, we did a third part was a policy roadmap. So obviously we were doing a Horizon Europe project, so we had to also have some kind of conclusions for the Commission in order to think about these technologies. And just to briefly mention, because yeah, we come up with several recommendations, but I think the ones that I think are most kind of interesting maybe for this forum are, for example, soft biometrics processing. So, of course, biometrics is already regulated in GDPR, but that concept of biometrics is obviously tied to personal data. So there's a big range of other biometric data that is actually not personal data because it doesn't allow the identification of an individual, but still is very relevant. And we thought that this, in particular, soft biometrics, as called by the literature, we think that I think it's very relevant because it has an impact on users' rights. And for example, a colleague of us once gave us an example. There was, for example, some devices actually capture voice vibration, and that's not personal data, but still can have an impact because then you can categorize the user within, for example, gender. So if companies don't actually take the measures, this could be have a big effect of, for example, misgender some individual. So of course, it's very difficult from a legislative perspective to add this in the GDPR. But we think that probably will be positive that the authorities could have some guidelines on this respect, especially considering XR. So it could be general soft biometrics guidelines, but also tailored to immersive technologies. The second one was bystanders, which is not a new issue, right? But we think that there's also not much said regarding XR technologies. It's very different than the guidelines that we actually can see from the EDPB. For example, there's video cameras guidelines, but those are they in some ways address this issue, but for XR is very different perspective. Because, of course, there's an imbalance between who is the user of the device and who is actually surrounding this person. So in terms of lawfulness of the gathering of the data, in terms of how they can actually know who is processing the data, transparency issues, and of course, how bystanders can actually exercise the data subject rights under the GDPR. So we also think that it will be very positive that the EDPB also has some kind of guidelines regarding bystanders in the XR, but also in general. And the third one is, of course, AI. There's almost now natural integration between those two. And of course, they by themselves, XR and AI, they have can have a very big impact on users. There's high risk in both of them separately, but then when you integrate them, if you add the immersiveness and then the kind of deception that you can cause using AI, then the risk is higher. So we believe that it will be interesting to integrate this as a high-risk case in the AI Act. And there's a lot of ways that the Commission can actually do it, because there's delegated legislation or can be through interpretative guidelines. But definitely we would like to see immersive use of AI as a high-risk case in the AI Act. And another part of our project was going through the soft law approach, which is basically drafting a code of conduct. This was meant for, of course, designers, developers, and in general, stakeholders in the XR environments. And as you can see, several of the kind of issues are address principles that are already embedded in the EU legislation, but we wanted to make it more concise and more kind of tailored to XR, so people that doesn't have a legal background, of course, can understand these issues and implement them in a code of conduct. And of course, this document is a living document. This was firstly draft, but also we had feedback from the industry. So it's a really project that is ongoing. Well, there's also kind of the last three topics, I will say, they're more tailored to XR. Identity, of course, is a big issue. How we can exercise our identity on our personas in the metaverse, and also especially regarding vulnerable groups, so as children. Also, how share spaces we can moderate the exchange between users in the virtual space. And finally, engagement with non-human resources, and here we kind of grouped from one side the interaction with AI agents in the metaverse, but also how the examples, like the example that was given regarding the effect in the physical world, that's also very important. We saw that a lot of in the virtual world, when it's linked to a physical space, it can have effects on heritage, it can have effects on private property. Example of Pokemon Go is the classic one. So how you can actually impact a physical space by the use of augmented reality or virtual reality. And we also are very much aware of the political context. We are proposing regulation, we're proposing changes, amendments, but of course it doesn't seem like it is the time for that because it's pushback, of course, from the US, from the big tech. I took this paragraph from a recent publication. It's related to AI, but I think it applies also to XR and general to digital technologies. And from the other side, also, we don't want not just to have ethical use of XR, but we want a use of XR in the practice and be commercially successful in Europe because we're lagging behind. So I think for us, it's also kind of a reality check. We need to see not just try to reform the law, because that's very difficult. As I already said, you could do soft law, or you could do more interpretative or guidelines regarding the authorities. And kind of to close, I would like to kind of take the modalities of regulation by Lawrence Lessig, because I think is a good summary of this, and I think from the panel as well, maybe. Because, of course, we are talking about a lot about law, and we were proposing changes, but, of course, as I was saying, it's very difficult to do it, especially these days. And also going through soft law, as, for example, code of conduct. But I was thinking that also we need to consider the other two modalities of regulation, because they're very relevant. In particular, I would say architecture, so code is law. Companies actually have a very big power, and they regulate how these technologies work by the design. So I was thinking while preparing this, how we can impact that, because it's very difficult. And, well, we are in a university. I also work for a university. I think awareness and education are key here, because we are training the professionals that will engage with these technologies. So I think ethics and the principles should be very much present on education and awareness. And finally, the fourth, I hope there's no one from Meta here, but the market, I think, is very relevant. Sometimes we don't look at them as we should. And we as consumers, we have a big power. Maybe Europe is not the main hub of innovation. We have to work on that. But we are a big market. And we see how the discussions from consumers and the impact from consumers makes a difference. And from XR perspective, that's already happened in the past. We had the Google glasses that were canceled because of there was a lot of privacy concerns. Not so much now with the Ray-Ban Meta glasses, unfortunately. And more recently with the Metaverse, the shutting down by Meta. I think if users are not comfortable with technology, because for any reason, that's also very important. So we need to consider that as a way of regulation as well. And Europe has a very important say here. And just to close, I think none of these kind of modalities is enough by itself. So as a lawyer, also very much regulation, but I think we need to use these four in order to make changes and make sure that the future of XR is safe and ethical for all of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Marco. And now let's open the floor for the discussion and the questions. Who would like to ask a question, the first one? Or some comments, maybe?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
So first, thank you very much for the 3 presentations. Very, very insightful. Okay, I will introduce myself. I'm Begoña Otero. I'm a senior research fellow affiliated with the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition in Munich. So I want to mainly address a question from, my question is more for Simon, but it's also open for the others and also for Verity and Marco, please feel free. So, because I think everything here is very well connected, although it might not seem so from the, or for the outside looker. So, Simon, you were talking about precisely, I think you hit the nail when you talk about the potential ways of assessing these willing for everyone or governments to, and even I will say big techs to go for bans, and how this is not really working and how this will never work. But when we look at what we have, at least in Europe, when you mention the DSA, the risk assessment, I have the feeling that every time we look at or we come with something like by design in the end, it comes with a caveat. And we always have the side of the big tech telling us, but this is not efficient, but we will lose a lot of money here because everything is coming from the advertising. So we have to change the whole business model, and this will bring us nowhere. So I wonder, I know that it comes by binding standards and not recommending standards, put it like that, but still, how to put more pressure on the legislator, I haven't figured it out. It's so we'll be very happy to hear that from you, because I don't feel that this change will come from big tech. And we see that also in other forums, like the research that came out, the journalist research on what is happening with data centers, AI, and the data. And so from last week, I think The Guardian was So that also relates a bit to what you said, Verity. But I have the feeling that, you mentioned these 3 layers. I have the feeling that we still need one for, an additional one, because somebody mentioned, I think it was in the beginning, neuro rights. And this is coming, So it's not anymore a simulation. It's a top, I will say, it's an additional or reinforced simulation when we start looking at, we have seen that in Black Mirror, and we have seen that, but it's coming, it's becoming reality. We have seen that already happening in the, war-related or military research, and its implants coming into the brain or other parts of the body, So, and that also relates to what you said. Yeah, we can make policy recommendations. We need to emphasize on literacy, training, education. But still, I look at, for instance, other instances like UNESCO, the CSO network, and it's very difficult for CSOs to find a space in the policy debate and become visible, because everything seems to. So how? I'm very happy to listen to ideas on how to push more into that direction. Thank you.
Okay. Oops, sorry. I won't touch it. It's very sensitive. Yes, so thank you very much for your question, and I understand where you're coming from, because sometimes you can really get a bit hopeless, feeling you feel hopeless in a sense, and I don't want to do that, and I don't want to feel that. And to be honest, I've also been very disappointed, because when the GDPR was adopted, and entered into force in 2018, I thought the world would change. Because I think a lot of these things that we worried about, and that I also showed on the slides, like the design that leads to compulsive use, which is to a large extent part of the commercial profiling of users, including children, could have already been addressed by the GDPR. And it wasn't because, well, for reasons I won't go into, but it wasn't. So I'm much more hopeful now under the DSA, because and one of the things that helps is that at least for the very large online platforms, the enforcement has been centralized to the European Commission. They have a lot of resources. They hired a lot of people, even some of my students, to be part of the DSA unit that enforces the DSA and has as a priority also the protection of minors. Still, it takes time. And I think what would be helpful, so we can still improve things. And I'm not saying it will happen overnight, so it might still take time, but we see a lot of developments. We see the cases in the US, Los Angeles, where Meta and YouTube were being fined. Meta was fined in New Mexico. There's a lot of enforcement activity from the DSA. So there is a lot happening, but we can also still change some of these things. So what we might do is have clearer rules, especially under the GDPR. We know it's a principled regulation. It's based on principles, which in a sense is good. Because it doesn't really, well, to a certain extent, maybe it needs updating in terms of mental data and neurological data, so we can have a discussion about that. But to a large extent, to deal with my issues, at least, it doesn't need to be updated. But I would like to have clearer red lines in the law, because the companies will not do anything unless we show them what the red lines are and they're being fined for it. And to a certain extent, so the changes are incremental in a sense. They only do something when they're being told that they need to do it. And then sometimes they only do it for the EU, but there's children living everywhere, so it should not only be for the EU. The other thing is enforcement takes a lot of time because of these investigations that need to be careful, meticulous, but you could also, you could shift the burden of proof to the companies where they need to show that actually what they're doing is complying with the law. So having an accountability principle like we have under the GDPR, but also make sure that that it's part of the risk assessments that they need to do. We could have, specific methodologies for these risk assessments, because now it's a little bit, the companies do whatever they want, and we see that these risk assessments are not satisfying. They're not focusing on the issues that we want them to focus on. So we could have a very specific methodology for that they need to use to actually do these risk assessments every year. So I think there are, we could centralize enforcement for the GDPR as well. So we could update the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, which we're working on with the Digital Fairness Act, to also update the red lines for commercial practices and also focusing on things like addictive design. So it's not going to change overnight, and sometimes I get a little bit cynical as well, but I also like to keep working on how we can make these changes that actually might be helpful. Because I agree totally with you, if we don't do anything, these practices will not change because they make a lot of money. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. No, I agree with everything you said. I think you're exactly right as well to point at the business model. Every time the pushback from these companies is, but the only way that this is monetizable is if it feeds the kind of the algorithm for advertising, and that's all about behavioral data. It's, what type of person will do this if they receive this kind of information, in what order, and so everything about the business model is social profiling and monetization. I think this is not controversial. We know that that's the model for social media, and I think one of the reasons why social media companies were some of the first to move into metaverse and sort of 3D spatial environments is that data is so good in those spaces. You know, it stops being about did I dwell for a minute here? Did I click? Did I share? And it becomes, did I look at you? How long did I look at you for? Did my pupils dilate when I looked at you? Like, what did I then do? Who did I talk to about you? Did I buy something that reminded me of you? You know, the behavioral data is so good in these 3D environments. It was a real kind of gold rush for these social media companies to move into spatial computing. And the assumption was that business model could come too, that sort of the behavior of people in social spaces was capital for the companies. And I think they've been quite disappointed that people seem to genuinely disagree with them on that, hence why a lot of these things are now kind of shutting down. But I think there's a really brilliant opportunity in this question that we have about banning social media for kids or creating something different, because I think there is, for better or for worse, there is a sort of a kind of a social acceptance that we want these platforms for free, and so I guess we'll give away our data. But what if, for example, for younger people, there was a hard line that said advertising is not part of these spaces, algorithmic decision-making is not part of these spaces, behavioral profiling is not part of these spaces. So therefore, the alternatives that could be designed for children would likely be paid for services. Maybe parents would buy an app on the understanding that there's no advertising or no profiling going on. My guess is that the market would pay for that. And then there'd be challenges around what about people who can't afford to pay for that? But it is a potential opportunity, I think, for a different business model to be suggested for young and vulnerable people that isn't advertising and algorithm only. And there's a certain kind of social reconditioning we can do to ourselves if we prove that we are prepared to pay a certain amount for a social media offering for children, if it means that we break that contract with the advertising. And there's a generation that could grow up with that might be more prepared to pay €3 for something rather than giving away all of their biometric psychography and their personal neurological rights in exchange for whatever it is that we get from these things.
Thank you so much. I totally agree with you. Any other question from the audience? Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Vera Lúcia Raposo. I'm a professor of law and tech at Nova School of Law in Lisbon. Well, my question is specifically to Marco, even though obviously you can jump in at any minute, because I would like to know a little bit more about your idea of including immersive AI specifically in the AI Act, as I believe you said, the high-risk AI system. If you could develop a little bit, like, will you include it in Annex 3, just like you have biometric technologies will be one, like immersive AI? If you could clarify. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think in some ways you can argue that the high-risk cases in the AI Act already address some of the uses of in XR, but not all of them. Because, for example, there's a lot of talking about biometrics in the high-risk cases, but it's very limited to certain kinds of biometric, not even the hard biometrics of the GDPR. It's very specific cases, certain cases that actually lead to high risk. So there's a lot of room for this for regulation, and I think because of the immersiveness, we have seen the impact that has. So I remember a case of I think it was in Japan that they use VR for connecting with your loved ones that pass away. And that's very, very impactful because obviously they use a lot of data and even biometrics. And then they can manipulate people, and then you can feel like thinking about kind of the future. You can then you can have ads offering you certain services and products with a loved one that passed away or someone you trust. So I think the impact is very, very high, and that's why we would like to have a specific inclusion of immersive technologies use with powered by AI, let's say, in the AI Act as a high-risk case, because it certainly, I think, for me, qualifies as a significant risk of harm. And I think Yeah, I don't know, probably you have more to say about it, but...
Well, beware.
Yes.
Well, maybe not so much from your perspective, because I think you're the expert there, but I think we also have to go back to what the AI Act is. It's a product safety law. So, so if we see new areas of product safety emerge, and these high-risk systems are in an annex, you could easily update it. It's also about vulnerability. So if our people are more vulnerable in these immersive environments, and it might lead to new forms of harm that we hadn't envisaged when the AI Act was drafted and adopted, I would see opportunities to add new cases to that. And a case in point, it's not high risk, but we saw that the European Parliament adopted a proposal to actually add notify apps to the prohibited AI practices in Article 5. So we only just have the AI Act, and we see that it's already being updated. So I'm not entirely sure it answers your question, but it is promising that in a way, even with the digital omnibus and everything, that apparently there is also a tendency to really look at what the AI developments are and how they might be impacting the safety of people and also the fundamental rights of people, because they're also interconnected there. So it's a product safety law, but it's also envisaged to protect the fundamental rights of people impacted by AI systems. They're not necessarily the users. So, yeah. So I'm not sure if it answers your question, but these developments are hopeful for me to see that maybe the law can also be easily updated in terms of these new high-risk systems that might actually show new vulnerabilities in relation to safety issues. Actually also connected to a lot of the things that you were talking about. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Another question is here, and yes, maybe there.
Hi, my name is Casper. For a few years, I was head of the digital fairness projects at BEUC, the European Consumer Organization. So today I'm going to be this guy that says that I have more a comment on the question. There always has to be one. But I was triggered by what you said, Verity, about the by design suffix that triggers policymakers. We've seen this a lot. It's true. It's kryptonite, especially at DG Connect. But at the same time, there are. Wouldn't you say that there are signs of hope, given that also the attention of courts seems to be shifting from specific use cases to design? Take the California case against Google and Meta of last month. Take the Italian TikTok case. I hear that in January the court refused to suspend the ruling of the Autorita Garante, which found TikTok, for those of you guys not following this one, TikTok was found to deliberately addict and condition brains of minors to increase monetization. So it was the first ruling in Europe that actually took into account the new guidance to the UCPD. Unfortunately, not a binding guidance. So overall, again, so sorry, there is no question there actually, but wouldn't you say that there is actually perhaps this is the bandwagon we should be jumping on, and let's build the courage to speak of fairness by design, because it can be done. We have data protection by design in Article 25 GDPR. We all know how the GDPR is being enforced. That's a completely different story. But consumer law has been dealing with principles since day one. We can't afford to have that. But would you get behind that as an obligation to trade fairly, a horizontal one?
I like a sort of a call for anarchy at the beginning. Yeah, and I was here you mentioned about by design. I think you're exactly right to bring up the recent court findings, and I was probably quite surprised that the US was the first to find in this way. Section 223, I think it is, has been such an insulation for tech companies. It's this idea that they are neutral publishing platforms and they're not responsible for the content. And they were never, I think, imagining that they could be held liable for what was brought to them. I mean, I think of the court case in question, there were like 5 or 6 companies held, and most of them settled, but Meta and Google decided to persist, and have now been found liable for the design of their platforms being harmful to the users. And so this idea that they are somehow kind of neutral, apolitical, sort of just a little foundation to build on, and then the content is the responsibility of the people who make it, has been completely shaken in a way that I'm finding really enjoyable. So yeah, I think we are moving into a slightly different moment now, where that presumed neutrality of platforms has been quite significantly knocked, and that question then of design is forefront. I think before the assumption was that it was too kind of ephemeral to be pinned down, but the evidence-based way in which that's been shown to be part of the business model, that it's not an accident that these platforms are addictive and that they are not working in the best interests of their users, and that the business model is based not on user well-being, is really important. And I would absolutely get behind you in that conga to kind of push that narrative, because I think it's really helpful.
And that wasn't the first case, the one in Los Angeles. I don't know whether you know about the court case. One was against Omegle, where the US court said that Omegle, which is a chat roulette service, and there was a lot of child sexual abuse going on. It was infamous for that. There the court said, well, it's actually defective by design, because it can never be safe for children in that case. And there was another court case against Snapchat. They had a speed filter where you were driving really fast and making a picture. It would show on the picture how fast you were driving. So you wonder whatever might go wrong with that, Well, three boys died in a car crash. They drove into a tree, so a court case came out of that from their parents. And there also the US court said, well, this is a functionality that is defective by design, because it can, it's unsafe by design, basically. And of course, Snapchat discontinued the speed filter, but you see that those were already cases before the one that we had now in Los Angeles. And of course, Meta and YouTube will, or Google, they will appeal. So we'll have to see what happens next. But I think it's a very encouraging development that we start recognizing, and that courts start recognizing that that there are design features. Because also, most of us are a little older, so you might have been on Facebook, years ago. It was a much more friendly environment as compared to now. So you don't agree? So yeah. So my daughter also said, because she used to be on, so she's not a child anymore, but she used to be on Musical.ly and then later on TikTok, and she also said, well, when Musical.ly was taken over by TikTok, it became much more of a toxic environment, and it's all down to the way it's being designed, and and that design obviously ties in with making more money. So I think it's encouraging that we see these court cases, and that courts are actually, are not seeing these as neutral platforms, because that's the argument that they have, but actually look for, how these platforms make things unsafe for children by design.
Thank you so much.
Okay, now it's working. Okay, I'm Paolo Campigiani. I work for Namirial, which is a qualified trust service provider in Europe. And also it happens that I'm a standardization expert, more or less. Now, referring to your, Marco, to one of your slides, when you say that there are different forces that could shape for a better XR world, you say the law, the architecture, the market, and the code of conduct. I think that would also add the standards, because standards is not code of conduct, which is somehow voluntary, and they are not law, but could be particularly effective in Europe because in Europe we have this principle of harmonized standards, this idea of presumption of conformity. So when I see the list of some possible appropriate by design solution, as Professor van der Hoef said, to have social networks that are appropriate for children, like private profiles, messages only from friends, whatever. These are the kind of technical things that make sense to be described in a standard. Because the benefit in using a standard is that you could adapt it every time it's needed without changing the law. I could make you the example about digital identity. If you look at as how digital signature works in Europe, the law describing it is 3 lines or 4 lines in the regulation. The implementing acts, it's like 10, 20 pages, and the standard are several thousand pages, because we have to consider all the possible corner cases, all the implications, and we are adapting these standards every time. Of course, if you do this, we have a problem, because if you want to create a standard on social networks, the risk that you have in Europe is that all the experts from TikTok, Meta, whatever, are participating in the development of the standard. But the European Commission has the power to reject the results if they are not good, but also people like you could actually participate in the development of the standards. Yes, in which standard, if I could ask?
I've participated in turning the IEEE Age-Appropriate Design Standard into the CEN-CENELEC Age-Appropriate Design Services Framework. And we're now in the process, there are some hiccups, but we're now in the process to turn that into a CEN-CENELEC standard.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, absolutely timely. Okay, thank you. Yes, this could be something that we have to consider, because from my personal experience, I'm self-taught in standardization. I started 10 years ago working on this. A very limited number of people knows about standardization. It's not taught in the university. That's a problem. People from economics, from law, or from engineering do not know a lot about how standardization works, so do not participate. And the result is that, of course, there is a risk that standards are very limited public discussion and exposure, but they could be, generally speaking, the way to solve some of these problems. Absolutely. This is something that I feel, and it could make a lot of sense if we say simply in a law, every social network in Europe shall comply with this standard. And this standard is about providing age appropriateness for children or whatever. That could be an effective way. Of course, it will take some years to do this, absolutely. No, develop a standard in Europe, it's like 2 years, but more 3 years, typically speaking, of hard work. But this could be an effective solution to address some of your concerns. That's just a statement on my side, but just to share this with you. Thank you.
A quick reference, there was a report this year from the Ada Lovelace Foundation, and my co-author Catherine Allen was involved, where they were looking entirely at this question of who's designing these tools and technologies, and they interviewed a huge number of XR developers and designers, so the people literally making these products and developing them. And what they effectively reported was that these are often incredibly kind of like thoughtful, conscientious people who really want to be minimizing harms and following ethical guidelines, but they either don't know what that would look like, or when they try and do so are told by their clients, by their kind of commissioners, there's no time for that, there's no money for that, that works against the business model, there's no, where's the profit? And what that community kind of were calling for was a set of standards and guidelines so that they could push back on those clients and say, we have to build this in by design because it says so, and without that kind of formal layer of recommendation and standardization, they've got no kind of tools to use to push back against that more kind of commercial imperative. So I'm really with you there. I think some clear guidance that everyone in that supply chain can point to and hold themselves to will really help.
Yeah, one of the problems might be, of course, that to be in that standardization process, you need to pay to become a member of your... Yeah, well, as an academic, you don't always have that money, so it might be easier for the industry to actually be part of that whole process. On the good side, with the work we do on age-appropriate design, there were no, the industry wasn't really part of it, because it's also a bit soft in a sense, you know. talking about children's rights and age-appropriate design, it's more like social technical rather than, you know, highly technical. So most of these standards are very technical, of course. So you have the technology as part of that. But another remark I wanted to make is that I mentioned in my presentation that we have, we have Article 28 in the Digital Services Act, which is about the protection of the privacy, safety and security of children. And the European Commission really quickly made guidelines to explain what that means, because that's a very open norm. It can mean anything, basically. But they very quickly made these guidelines to explain what it means. They also included children, which is, exceptional, basically, to draft these guidelines. And what they have said is that they will use them as the benchmark for enforcement. Because you mentioned earlier we have the UCPD guidance, but it's not law, and I agree with that. You know, we have all kinds of guidelines also under the GDPR, but they're not law. But in this case, if they're actually going to use them as a benchmark, they sort of get an indirect legal status because, and a lot of these examples I gave you for age-appropriate design actually come from these guidelines. So they're sort of pushed. Because the guidelines are not just about what you're not supposed to do. The European Commission really also wanted to provide what are good practices, you know, to say, okay, but then you should do this, which I think is a good approach. I'm a big fan of them. I'm not entirely a fan of their age assurance approach in the guidelines, but other than that, I think they provide some very good guidance to online platforms, and if they're going to use them as a benchmark and really also base their fines on that, then we might get a little bit maybe of a change that we're looking for. So yeah, in a sense, yes, standards, but we could also, this is, I think, also a development that's actually very helpful. But let's wait and see what happens, because,
Thank you so much. And now our panel comes to the end. So thank you so much for your insights and very fruitful discussion. Well, it's clear that ensuring safety in virtual world is still a challenge. And we have to do a lot, and it requires collaboration between technology, between policy and ethics as well. And now I invite you to continue our discussion formally over lunch. And we have a break, 1 hour break, and we meet again at 2:30. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Now.